Okay, hello you guys. In this video, we're going to start Unit 2 officially with the first set of notes. There's only two set of notes in Unit 2, so this is going to be a much quicker, faster unit than our previous unit. In this unit, though, we're going to look at cells. We're going to talk a lot about cells, which are the basic unit of life. In these notes specifically, we're going to look at just a general overview of the huge variety of cells that exist on this planet and some of their these structures inside of cells and the function of those structures. And so specifically, we're going to look at topic 1 in this video, which we're going to go over just the different types of cells in general that exist in life on this planet. And so just to give you guys super basic background information about cells. Hopefully we all know by now that cells are what create and build living things on this planet. A cell is the smallest unit of life, meaning that that's the simplest entity of matter that counts as life or a living thing. It's a cell. There's a huge variety of different cells that exist on this planet, but there are some common features that they all have. And so let's start with that. Let's talk about things that all cells have in common on this planet. First and foremost, all cells have a cell membrane. So there's 4 things we're going to go through. We're going to go through the fact that all cells have a plasma membrane that surrounds the cell. They all have a cytoplasm, which is the jelly-like fluid that fills the cell. They all have genetic material of some sort, which is their DNA. And they all have ribosomes, which are going to build all the proteins in the cell. And so starting with the plasma membrane, this is the structure that surrounds the cell. Like I talked about in last unit, the plasma membrane, the primary component of the plasma membrane is these phospholipids, which are a type of lipid. If you guys remember, they have that glycerol molecule with the 2 fatty acids and then the phosphate group. And so in a phospholipid, a lot of times you guys see it like what it's shown in this picture, just a simple diagram showing a circle with 2 tails attached to it. That circle represents the hydrophilic head or the polar head, which likes water. But then these tails, these fatty acids, they do not like water. They're nonpolar, they're hydrophobic. In cells and in aqueous solutions and in living things, these form a bilayer where you guys can see this arrangement here where they all line up next to each other. But then there's actually a whole second layer of them lined up next to each other, and they're facing each other in a way where the fatty acids that are hydrophobic and don't like water, they're in the interior of the membrane, and then the polar heads, they're pointing on the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell where there's water. And so this is a happy little arrangement that they form here. So we call this a phospholipid bilayer. It's 2 layers of these phospholipids all lined up. And then also in the plasma membrane, you're going to see a bunch of proteins embedded in the membrane, and we'll talk a lot about this in the next set of notes. The next set of notes is all about the cell membrane. But these proteins, they're embedded in the cell membrane, and they do a huge variety of different things. Some of them, for example, are transport proteins, which allow things to go into and out of the cell. We say that the cell membrane is semi-permeable because it allows certain things to go into the cell, but then other types of things can't go into the cell. These proteins play an important role in that because some of their jobs include letting certain things into and out of the cell and not letting other things into and out of the cell. So that's the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. All cells have that. All cells have a cytoplasm. Like I said earlier, this is the jelly-like fluid that fills the cell, where everything is suspended in. A lot of times you'll hear the word cytoplasm and cytosol used kind of interchangeably. There is a technical difference between the two, but it honestly doesn't matter. Just think of them as the same thing. The cytosol and the cytoplasm, we're referring to the interior of the cell. And that cytoplasm is specifically that gel-like fluid inside the cell. All cells have that. All cells have genetic material. This is almost always in the form of DNA. And so this DNA is storing all the information needed for that cell and for that living organism. And we'll talk a lot about that throughout this year. There are some exceptions where the genetic material might be RNA, and it's really not common. I mean, that's only basically when we're talking about RNA being the genetic material, that's when we're talking about viruses. And viruses, we don't really consider, well, they're not cells, and we don't really consider them living. It gets a little complicated, but just know, like, usually when we're talking about genetic material, we're talking about DNA. And so anyway, all cells have some DNA or genetic material that stores that information that's going to be passed on to future cells when the cells divides. Then all cells lastly have ribosomes. So ribosomes are these really small structures inside the cell. Usually when you're looking at a picture or a diagram of a cell, they're represented as little tiny dots because they're pretty tiny. They're made up of a small and a large subunit that come together when the ribosome is functioning. The function of ribosomes is to build proteins. So they're the ones that actually put the amino acids together. If you guys remember, proteins are made up of amino acids. There's like 20 different amino acids. Those amino acids are going to be put together and bonded together to form the primary structure or the sequence of that protein, which is then going to fold up into its secondary, tertiary, and possibly quaternary structure, and then finally have its functional shape inside the cell where it's going to go do something super specific and important. But ribosomes, they're the ones that build and put together the proteins, and then those proteins do basically everything inside the cell and inside your bodies. So super important. Ribosomes get the instructions to build your proteins from your DNA. So your DNA is actually what stores the information. That's why we call it the genetic material. It actually is what has the instructions to build all the different proteins inside the cells and inside of living organisms. So that actual sequence of amino acids that needs to be put together, that information is in your DNA. And then that information will be sent to ribosomes, and then ribosomes will use that information to actually build and construct the polypeptide, the amino acids, putting them together to build the protein. So a lot of times an analogy is used, like the proteins are kind of like the construction workers building the actual components, these proteins that are doing a million different things inside the cell. But the instructions, they're using like some kind of blueprint, which is like your DNA, which actually has the instructions to build all those proteins. Cells can have a lot of times, usually cells are going to have lots and lots of ribosomes inside of their cells, building proteins all the time. So those are the main characteristics that we find in all cells. So in all cells, no matter what cell you're looking at, it's going to have a plasma membrane that surrounds the cell. It's going to be filled with a cytoplasm. It's going to have genetic material, and it's going to have ribosomes. Now beyond that, there's a million more things that we could find in cells. But if we're going to categorize cells beyond that, there's two main categories that all cells will fall into in this planet that's going to start demonstrating their differences, and that's prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. So cells on this planet are either going to be prokaryotic cells or they're going to be eukaryotic cells. Hopefully some of this sounds super familiar from freshman bio, but real quick, we'll kind of go through this really quickly to jog your memory. Prokaryotes, these are single-celled organisms who are made of prokaryotic cells. So when I say a prokaryote, I'm talking about a living thing who's made of prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotes are always going to be single-celled organisms, so like the whole organism is just one cell. So usually, most of the time, we're talking about bacteria, for example. Or a lot of times we just say bacteria. Bacteria basically means prokaryotes. We usually just call prokaryotic organisms bacteria. And these are, again, single-celled organisms, just one cell. That's the whole organism. And that cell that they're made of, the big thing that we're going to see or not see in prokaryotic cells is they're not going to have a nucleus. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, which is the structure that that eukaryotic cells do have, where the DNA is stored. So in prokaryotic cells, the DNA is just floating inside the cell. It's not surrounded by a nucleus. And so that's the key characteristic of a prokaryotic cell. It doesn't have a nucleus. Whereas in eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus that is protecting and surrounding the genetic material inside the cell, the DNA. That DNA would be found inside the nucleus, which is, in this picture, this big old purple thing right here. And inside here is all the DNA, which you don't see in prokaryotic cells. You do see DNA, but it's just floating around in the inside. And so eukaryotes, the word eukaryote refers to an organism who's made of eukaryotic cells. So we would say that organism over there is a eukaryote. Why is it a eukaryote? Because it's made of eukaryotic cells, which are cells that do have a nucleus. Now eukaryotes, so these organisms that are made of eukaryotic cells, they can be single-celled organisms or multi-celled organisms. So for eukaryotes, there are eukaryotic organisms who are made of just one cell, like prokaryotes, but that cell does have a nucleus. But then a lot of times, a lot of eukaryotes are multicellular organisms who are made of many, many, many different cells that form that one organism. So anytime you're looking at a multicellular organism, that's going to for sure be a eukaryote, because only eukaryotes can be multicellular. Prokaryotes will never be multicellular. So for example, a human being, we are made of trillions of cells. So you are definitely a eukaryote. You are a eukaryotic organism, and you're made of eukaryotic cells. So inside your cells, I will for sure see a nucleus. And then the other thing in eukaryotic cells, you're going to see a nucleus, but then you're going to see a lot of other fun, exciting things in here. There's going to be all these other structures, these specialized structures that are surrounded by membranes inside of a eukaryotic cell that we don't really see in prokaryotic cells. So in prokaryotic cells, they don't have this extensive network of membrane and special membrane-bound organelles. By that I mean all these structures have their own plasma membrane surrounding them, and we'll talk about all of these in topic 2. But you're not going to see any of that in prokaryotic cells. That's another big difference as well. So here's a basic prokaryotic cell. There's obviously a huge variety of prokaryotic cells. They can look very different and unique from one another. But here are some common things that we see. First of all, the DNA is going to be centralized inside the cell somewhere, not surrounded by a nucleus, but somewhere centralized in the cell. And we call that region the nucleoid. So the nucleoid is this region where the DNA is. It's different than the word nucleus. So it's not a nucleus, it's just a nucleoid. That's just the region where the DNA is. And then they do have a cell membrane, because all cells have a cell membrane. They do have cytoplasm. All cells have cytoplasm. They do have ribosomes. All cells have ribosomes, which are these little dots that you see everywhere. Those are the ribosomes. And then the DNA. So DNA is organized into chromosomes. So a chromosome is one long piece of DNA that contains a bunch of instructions for proteins, a bunch of genes on it. In prokaryotes, they only have one. Prokaryotic cells will only have one chromosome. So they have one single chromosome inside the cell, and it's actually circular. So if I took out this DNA, it's actually one piece of DNA, one super long piece of DNA, and it's actually circular, meaning like it actually forms one giant loop. So it's kind of like a twisted up rubber band. If you took out the rubber band and you untwist it, it's one single loop of DNA. So in prokaryotes, they have one chromosome, and that chromosome is circular. And then you'll see some other stuff on here. Prokaryotic cells always have a cell wall, which is a structure surrounding the cell membrane. So if you look closely at this picture, there's kind of like 3 layers on the outside. The inside layer is the plasma membrane, which is where this is pointing to. And then the outside of that is the cell wall, which you can kind of barely see in this picture, which is outside of the plasma membrane. And then outside of that, they also have a lot of times prokaryotic cells have a capsule, which is this jelly-like coating on the very outside. So this thick outside layer, that's the capsule that prokaryotic cells have. And so that's pretty unique to prokaryotic cells, having this capsule structure surrounding the cell wall and the cell membrane. The cell wall of prokaryotes is made of a carbohydrate, a polysaccharide called peptide glycan. So that's the thing that builds the cell wall in bacteria cells. There are some eukaryotes, which we'll talk about in a second. There are some eukaryotic organisms that also have a cell wall. Not all of them do. Like our cells don't have cell walls, but there are some eukaryotic cells that do have cell walls. But their cell wall is actually made of a different carbohydrate. It's made of cellulose, which is, plants, for example, they have a cell wall made of cellulose. And they're eukaryotic. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. And then there's also, I'll just say it right now, and I'll bring it up again in a second. There's also fungus or fungi. Fungi are eukaryotes as well, like us. And they also have a cell wall, but their cell wall is made of chitin, which we've talked about before in Unit 1. So it's just different carbohydrates used to build a cell wall. So prokaryotes, they have a cell wall, and it's made of peptide glycan. Now in eukaryotic cells, think eukaryotic, the E for eukaryotic is for exciting, E for exciting. Like there's a lot of stuff going on in a eukaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells, they're pretty simple. But in a eukaryotic cell, we got our fancy little nucleus and all these other fun structures that do a lot of different things, which we'll talk about in topic 2. But that DNA, first and foremost, like I said, is inside the nucleus. That DNA is organized into chromosomes. So you guys have inside the nucleus, there are different pieces of DNA, super long pieces of DNA we call a chromosome. Now in eukaryotes, they're usually almost always going to have more than one chromosome. Like humans inside, if I was looking at one of your cells and I went inside your nucleus, I would see all the DNA. And if I start pulling out that DNA, it's actually 46 pieces of DNA. Humans have 46 chromosomes. And so it depends on the organism. Some organisms have even more than that. Some organisms have less than that. But we usually have more than one chromosome. And our chromosomes are not circular. So in eukaryotes and eukaryotic organisms, they do have DNA. They do have chromosomes. But these chromosomes are actually linear. So they're actually just one long strand that has two ends. It's not a circular piece of DNA. So that's another important difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, is that we have linear chromosomes inside the nucleus, and usually more than one chromosome. Sometimes there's organisms that have over 100 chromosomes inside their nucleus. And then, like I said earlier, all these little structures here are called organelles. A lot of these organelles, so these are structures inside the cell that have specific jobs that do important things for the cell. And a lot of these organelles in eukaryotes are going to be membrane bound. So membrane bound means that they're surrounded by cell membrane. So not only do we have this plasma membrane, the cell membrane surrounding the cell, which is made of a phospholipid bilayer, all of these organelles that you guys see in here, including the nucleus and all these guys that we'll talk about soon, these are all contain cell membranes too. They're all surrounded by cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer. And so there's a lot of membranes inside of eukaryotic cells. And then at the end of these topic one, I just want to give you guys a generalized overview of life on this planet and the different categories that we have. So there's something called taxonomy. Taxonomy is like the categorization of living things on this planet into groupings based off of the evolutionary history of how these organisms have evolved. And so this is a very extensive field. Luckily in this class, they do not expect you guys to know a lot about taxonomy because it does require a huge amount of memorizing, and with all these fancy terms of different types of organisms, and it's crazy. If you Google the tree of life, you'll see like all the different groups of life that exist and how they're all connected, and you can take future science classes about it, and it's painful to try to memorize it all. But in this class, you guys just need to know the three main, well, you just need to know some basic overall groups. And the largest level of organization and taxonomy are called domains. There's 3 domains of life, which are shown here. There's bacteria, there's eukarya, or sometimes called eukaryota, and then there's Archaea. These are the 3 main groups of living things. So living things fall into one of these 2 groups. These 2 groups, bacteria and Archaea, these are prokaryotic organisms. So these are prokaryotes, these are prokaryotes made of prokaryotic cells. Eukarya, this is where all the eukaryotic organisms are. They fall into this group, which are made of eukaryotic cells. But I don't know if this surprises you or not, but actually most species, like most living things on this planet, fall into these 2 categories, bacteria and Archaea. There's actually, I know when we think of life, we probably think of multicellular organisms, but they are a small portion compared to the huge vastness of all these single-celled organisms that live on this planet. They definitely are the dominant types of life on this planet, are single-celled organisms, believe it or not. We just don't really see them, so we don't think about them a lot. Anyway, here's a nice little, I made this little flow chart for you guys that kind of shows these different groups. So there's 3 domains of life. There's bacteria, Archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and Archaea, these are prokaryotic organisms. I'll talk about the difference in a second. And then there's eukarya, which are all the eukaryotes. Again, these guys do not have a nucleus. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. These guys, they do have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. These guys will always be unicellular. So these are single-celled organisms. Single-celled organisms, we say that they're unicellular. They do have a cell wall made of peptide glycan. So that's these guys. And then eukarya, there's the next set of groupings then for eukarya, and this is as far as we'll get in terms of taxonomy for AP Bio. But in eukarya, we could then divide the eukaryotes into these 4 categories. Some of these should look really familiar, animals and plants. And then there's also fungi, so fungus, which are not plants. They're different than plants. So things like mushrooms, for example. This might be what you might think of when you think of fungus. And then there's protist. Protist, a lot of students don't know about protist, but protist, this is, when I say protist, I'm talking about single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic. So these are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. So the whole organism is one cell, but it's actually made of a eukaryotic cell, not prokaryotic cells. So this falls into this grouping too. Just in terms of cell walls, because I was trying to talk about this earlier, bacteria, like I said, and archaea, prokaryotes, they have cell walls. And again, archaea, a lot of times the actual term is archaea bacteria, and then there's just normal bacteria, or we call it eubacteria. There's some fancy terms you might see, but in general, we just call all these guys bacteria for the simplicity's sake, even if it's not super accurate. But these are prokaryotes. There's a slight difference between these two types of bacteria or prokaryotes. And then in eukaryotes, if you guys look, they some like protists, some of them do have a cell wall, but not all of them. These single-celled eukaryotes, fungi, they do have a cell wall, and plants, they do have a cell wall surrounding their cell. You guys can see that I listed what it's made of. The cell wall in plants is made of cellulose. We talked about that. In fungus, their cell wall is made of chitin, which is the same thing that's used to build the exoskeleton of different animals. And then bacteria, their cell wall is made of peptide 2 glycan. But you can see fungi, plants, and animals, these are multicellular organisms. So hopefully that's all getting a little piece together for you in your brain. And you do need to know these groupings. I hope it's not too much, because this could get way more extensive and we could go into like hundreds of different groups. But so you guys can do it. Just spend some time quickly laying this out in your brain. This is what the categories of life that exist on this planet on a very vague, basic level. And so on these slides, it kind of talks about these different groups, which I kind of already said, so you could read through this, but it's a lot of what I said about eukarya, which are made of eukaryotic cells, and those different groups that I just talked about. But then there's archaea and bacteria, which are made of prokaryotic cells that are single-celled. Bacteria and archaea, they structurally are pretty similar, but genetically and biochemically, in terms of like the types of reactions we see in those different types of cells, they're actually very different from one another. And so in here, I kind of give you a brief overview of them. You guys don't need to know in any depth the difference between archaea and bacteria, these two types of prokaryotic organisms. But bacteria is usually what we're thinking of when we're thinking about prokaryotes. And we encounter them all the time in our lives. They're everywhere. They're on your skin right now. They're inside your body. They're on the surface of your table, and they're everywhere. But so are archaea. If I had to say the biggest difference that might be relevant to us is that archaea are usually talking about prokaryotes that can survive in very extreme environments. That's usually a key characteristic of archaea, is that these are types of life that we find in the most extreme environments on this planet, where you would think like there's no way life could exist there at these super high temperatures, or these extreme pHs, or at these extreme salt concentrations. But we do find these guys, they're crazy. They find a way to thrive in these really extreme environments. And so, but also know that there are archaea prokaryotes that do live in just normal environments as well. You guys have archaea bacteria living inside of you as well as with normal bacteria. So they can live in normal places too. And then, but yeah, so we're not going to go into any more depth on that, but just know that those are prokaryotes. And then among eukaryotes, like I said, there's those 4 groups of eukaryotes, or eukarya, this domain of life. Specifically, if we focused in this class, in probably like your previous biology class, we'll just focus on plants and animals, which are the most relevant, I guess, to us, maybe, because we think about these guys all the time. But in terms of plant cells and animal cells, so these are both eukaryotic cells. There are some differences between them. They are very similar. You guys do need to know the difference between a plant cell and an animal cell. This should have been taught in freshman bio. Just to remind you guys real quick, plant cells and animal cells, like I said, they're both eukaryotic cells, which means they have a nucleus. They have all these fun membrane-bound organelles. A lot of these organelles you're going to see, almost all of them you're going to see in both. So I see a nucleus, I see this thing called a rough ER and a smooth ER and a Golgi and mitochondria. Like, you're going to see that in both. Now, the difference is in plant cells, one thing that you'll see different in plant cells is, first of all, they have a cell wall surrounding the cell membrane. So there is a cell membrane, but then there's a cell wall surrounding that, which gives a lot of sturdy structural support to plant cells. Whereas animal cells, we do not, our cells and animal cells do not have a cell wall. That's one difference. Another difference is this big blob that you guys see right here. This is called a large central vacuole, which likes to fill up with lots of water and other random material inside of plant cells. Animal cells do not have this large central vacuole. So there's not this giant membrane sac filling up with water inside of eukaryotes, but we do see that, inside of animal cells, but we do see that in plant cells. So that's another difference. So cell wall, large central vacuole. And another thing you're going to see in this plant cell is chloroplast. Chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens, where plants can do this magical thing where they can make their own organic molecules using energy from sunlight, meaning that they don't have to eat organic molecules, like they can just build them themselves. Plant cells have that, and we'll talk a lot about those guys in this class. Animal cells do not have chloroplast, and so you're not going to see that here, which is why you guys do have to eat. If you're made of animal cells, we have to consume organic molecules because we can't just build them from scratch inside of our cells. So we'll talk about that later, but that's another big difference. Please know, though, a common misconception students have coming into this class is they think that plant cells have chloroplast and animal cells have mitochondria. And that is half true. Plant cells do have chloroplast. Animal cells do not have chloroplast. However, please know that we both have mitochondria. All eukaryotic cells have mitochondria. Plant cells have it. Animal cells have it. We have mitochondria. That's where ATP is going to be made to power the cell, which is happening in plant cells and animal cells. And then beyond that, a couple other differences in animal cells. There's a couple structures in animal cells that you'll see that you won't see in plant cells. One of them is centrioles, which are these churro-looking guys. Don't worry too much about them yet. We don't see those in plant cells. And then another thing is you're not going to really see lysosomes in plant cells. So lysosomes is another thing we're going to talk about in topic 2. Which is this guy right here. It's like a small little membrane sac. The animal cells have that, and plant cells don't really have that. They have things that are kind of similar to lysosomes, but not that. Anyway, you guys don't know what lysosomes are yet, but just those are the differences. And in topic 2, we'll talk about a lot of these different structures. And so that's it for this topic. Hopefully you have a nice breadth of knowledge about all these different types of cells and that exist on this planet. Anyway, see you guys later. Thank you.